I collapsed in the hospital hallway while visiting my grandmother, and when I woke up 3 days later, my parents were sitting beside my brother's bed instead of mine. The will reading 2 weeks later showed exactly who grandmother really loved. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by their choice, but I was. Maybe I shouldn't have smiled when the lawyer read that final clause, but I did. I should have seen it coming. The signs were always there, scattered like breadcrumbs through 26 years of my life, but I kept telling myself things would change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, that maybe this time would be different. That eventually, my parents would see me the way they saw Derek, my older brother. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was especially wrong about that. My name is Sarah, and I've spent most of my adult life working as a physical therapist at Memorial General Hospital. It's ironic, really, how much of my career has been dedicated to helping people heal, to helping them rebuild their strength after trauma, when I spent so many years unable to see how broken my own family dynamics were. I loved my job, loved the satisfaction of watching someone take their first steps after surgery, loved being the person who helped others find their way back to themselves. What I didn't love was going home to an empty apartment every night, wondering why I was always the one reaching out, always the one making plans, always the one trying to hold our family together. Derek was 3 years older and lived about as different a life as you could imagine, where I had spent my 20s building a career, earning my degree, working nights and weekends to pay off student loans. Derek had floated from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. Real estate ventures that never materialized, cryptocurrency investments that somehow always went south, business partnerships that ended in lawsuits or worse. But somehow, no matter how spectacularly he failed, he always landed on his feet. Or rather, he always landed in our parents' guest bedroom, with mom making his favorite meals and dad slipping him cash for whatever his latest emergency happened to be. I used to think it was just birth order. Older children get different treatment, more attention, higher expectations. But as we both moved through our 20s and into our 30s, it became clear that wasn't it at all. Derek got attention because he demanded it. He got support because he expected it. He got love because he never doubted he deserved it. Me, I got praised for being independent, for not being a burden, for never asking for anything. The thing about being the low-maintenance child is that people start to believe you actually don't need maintenance at all. They forget that independence isn't the same as not caring. They assume that because you don't cry about every setback, you don't have setbacks. They think that because you solve your own problems, you don't have problems worth solving. And after a while, you start to believe it too. You start to think that maybe you really are just different, that maybe you really don't need the same kind of love and support that other people need. It took me years to realize how messed up that was. Our grandmother, Helen, was different. She lived in a beautiful old Victorian house about an hour outside the city, the kind of place with creaky hardwood floors and rooms that smelled like vanilla and old books. When Derek and I were kids, we'd spend summers there, and she'd let us help her in the garden, teaching us the names of flowers and how to coax tomatoes to grow sweet and heavy on the vine. She never played favorites, never made one of us feel more special than the other. She just loved us, simply and completely, the way grandparents are supposed to love. As we got older and life got more complicated, I found myself driving out to visit her more often. Not because anyone asked me to, but because those quiet afternoons in her kitchen, drinking tea and listening to her stories about growing up during the war, felt like the only place where I could breathe. She'd ask about my work, really listen to my answers, remember the names of my difficult patients, and check in about them the next time I visited. She'd ask about my life, my hopes, my dreams in a way that made me feel like my thoughts actually mattered to someone. Derek visited less frequently. Usually only when he needed something. A loan, a place to crash, someone to vouch for him with a potential employer or landlord. Grandmother never said no, but I could see the sadness in her eyes when he'd leave again, promising to call more often and then disappearing for months at a time. She'd make excuses for him, the way she'd made excuses for our father when he was young, the way our parents made excuses for Derek now. But I knew she saw through it all. About 6 months before everything changed, I started noticing that grandmother wasn't quite herself. Little things at first. She'd forget a word in the middle of a sentence, or start a story and then trail off like she'd lost the thread. She'd ask me the same question twice in one conversation, or seem confused about what day it was. When I gently suggested she might want to see a doctor, she waved me off with that stubborn streak that ran through our whole family. "I'm fine, dear," she'd say, patting my hand. "Just getting old. Don't fuss," but I did fuss, because that's what you do when you love someone. I started visiting more often, bringing groceries when I noticed her refrigerator was getting sparse, quietly handling little repairs around the house that she'd stopped keeping up with. I coordinated with her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to check on her daily. I researched local elder care services, not because I wanted to take away her independence, but because I wanted to make sure she was safe. My parents lived 20 minutes closer to grandmother's house than I did, but somehow the responsibility always fell to me. When she had a minor fall in her bathroom and needed someone to drive her to urgent care, I was the one who got the call. When her old furnace started making strange noises and she needed someone to wait for the repair technician, I was the one who took a personal day from work. When she needed help organizing her medications, after a doctor's visit left her with a confusing array of new prescriptions, I was the one who spent my Saturday afternoon sorting pill bottles. I didn't mind. I loved her, and taking care of people has always felt natural to me. But I did notice that my parents never seemed to think about stepping in themselves. When I'd mention grandmother's latest need at family dinners, they'd nod sympathetically and then immediately launch into whatever crisis Derek was having that week. His latest failed business venture, his latest relationship drama, his latest financial emergency. "Derek's always been so sensitive," my mother would say, as if that explained why a 34-year-old man couldn't hold down a job for more than 6 months. "He just needs our support right now." I wanted to ask why grandmother's needs didn't seem to require the same urgency, but I'd learned years ago that pointing out these disparities only made me sound petty. So I kept quiet, kept taking care of things, kept being the reliable one who could be counted on to handle whatever needed handling. The day everything changed started like any other. It was a Thursday in late October, one of those crisp autumn days when the leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that clean, sharp quality that made you want to take deep breaths and make plans. I had finished my morning sessions at the hospital and was planning to drive out to see grandmother during my lunch break. She'd sounded tired on the phone the night before, complaining of a headache and some dizziness, and I wanted to check on her. I was walking through the main corridor of the hospital, heading toward the parking garage, when I felt it. A strange sudden weakness in my legs, like someone had unplugged me from a power source. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to get brighter and brighter, and the sounds of the hospital all around me seemed to fade into a distant hum. I remember thinking, very clearly, that something was wrong. I remember reaching for the wall to steady myself. And then I remember nothing. I woke up 3 days later, in a hospital bed, connected to more machines than I'd ever seen in one place. My head felt like it was full of cotton, my mouth was dry as sand, and when I tried to sit up, the room spun lazily around me like a broken carousel. A nurse I didn't recognize was checking the IV line in my arm, and when she saw me trying to move, she smiled and gently pressed me back against the pillows. "Easy there," she said. "You've been out for a while, let me get the doctor." The next few hours were a blur of medical terminology and concerned faces. Apparently, I'd collapsed from what the doctors were calling a severe electrolyte imbalance, caused by an underlying kidney condition that had gone undiagnosed for months, maybe years. My body had essentially shut down from dehydration and mineral deficiencies, and if a colleague hadn't found me within minutes of my collapse, the outcome might have been very different. "You're lucky," the attending physician told me, flipping through my chart. "A few more hours, and we might have been looking at permanent organ damage." Lucky? I didn't feel lucky. I felt confused and weak and strangely alone, despite being surrounded by the familiar faces of coworkers who'd been checking on me. Where were my parents? Where was Derek? I'd been unconscious for 3 days, and nobody had mentioned seeing them. When I finally worked up the courage to ask, the nurse looked uncomfortable. She glanced toward the door, then back at me, like she was trying to figure out how to deliver bad news. Well, she said carefully, your family has been here, they've been very worried about you. Something about the way she said it made my stomach clench. I waited for her to continue, but she seemed reluctant to go on. They're actually just down the hall, she finally said. Your brother was admitted yesterday. Food poisoning, nothing too serious, but they wanted to keep him overnight for observation. Your parents have been staying with him. Food poisoning. Derek had food poisoning, and my parents were sitting vigil beside his bed, while I woke up alone from a 3-day coma. I tried to process this information, tried to make it make sense, but my brain still felt foggy from whatever medications they had me on. The nurse must have seen something in my expression, because she quickly added, I'm sure they'll be by to see you as soon as they know you're awake. Let me go let them know. She hurried out of the room, leaving me alone, with the steady beeping of monitors, and the slow creeping realization that this was exactly what I should have expected. Of course Derek's minor illness took precedence over my major medical emergency. Of course my parents' attention was focused elsewhere. Of course I was waking up alone. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead I lay there, listening to the sounds of the hospital around me, thinking about all the times I'd been in rooms like this one, helping patients navigate their recovery, helping families cope with medical crises. I'd always assumed that if something serious ever happened to me, my family would rally around me the way I'd seen other families rally. I'd assumed that love would override everything else, that blood would be thicker than whatever petty dynamics had always governed our relationships. I was wrong about that too. When my parents finally appeared in my doorway, it was almost evening. They looked tired and rumpled, like they'd been sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, which they probably had. Just not beside my bed. Oh sweetheart, my mother said, rushing over to hug me. We were so worried about you. My father followed behind her, patting my shoulder awkwardly. How are you feeling, kiddo? You gave us quite a scare. I wanted to ask where they'd been for the past 3 days. I wanted to ask why Derek's food poisoning required round-the-clock attention, while my kidney failure apparently didn't. I wanted to ask why I was hearing about my brother's hospitalization for the first time now, as an explanation for their absence. But instead, I just smiled and told them I was feeling better. Because that's what I always did. I made it easy for them to do the minimum. They stayed for maybe 20 minutes, updating me on Derek's condition, assuring me that he was going to be fine, explaining that they'd been splitting their time between our rooms, but that he'd been having such a hard time keeping food down that they hadn't wanted to leave him alone for too long. They talked about how scary it had been when the hospital called to tell them about my collapse, how grateful they were that my coworkers had found me so quickly, how relieved they were that I was going to make a full recovery. All the right words, delivered in all the right tones, but somehow missing all the right feelings. When they left to go check on Derek, before visiting hours ended, promising to be back first thing in the morning, I finally let myself cry. Not the dramatic, cathartic kind of crying that you see in movies, but the quiet, exhausted kind that comes when you finally stop pretending that things are okay when they're not. I was released from the hospital 2 days later, with a strict medication regimen, and instructions to follow up with a nephrologist within the week. Derek had been discharged the morning after his admission, fully recovered from his bout of food poisoning, and already making plans to go camping with friends the following weekend. My parents offered to drive me home, but I could tell they were eager to get back to their regular routines, back to worrying about Derek's next adventure, instead of managing my medical needs. I called an Uber instead. My apartment felt strange and unfamiliar after nearly a week away, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. It was tidy and comfortable, decorated with plants, and books and photographs of friends and coworkers. But it was also very quiet, very empty, very much the home of someone who had learned to rely primarily on herself. Over the next few weeks, as I recovered and adjusted to my new medications and dietary restrictions, I had a lot of time to think about family dynamics and misplaced priorities, and what it really means to love someone. About the difference between being independent and being isolated.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the ways other people treat us. I also thought a lot about grandmother. I'd been worried about her before my collapse, and now I was feeling guilty about not being able to check on her as frequently as usual. When I finally felt well enough to make the drive out to her house, I found her in her garden, tending to the last of her autumn flowers, with the careful attention she'd always given to growing things. "Sarah, darling," she said, looking up from her chrysanthemums with a smile that seemed genuinely surprised and delighted. "I wasn't expecting you today." I hugged her carefully, noting that she seemed frailer than she had just a few weeks earlier, more delicate somehow. When I started to tell her about my hospitalization, she looked confused for a moment, like she was trying to remember something that was just out of reach. "Hospitalization," she said. "When were you in the hospital?" It took me a while to realize that no one had told her. My parents, who lived 20 minutes away and spoke to her every few days, had somehow forgotten to mention that their daughter had spent nearly a week in intensive care. Derek, who had been in the same hospital at the same time, had somehow not thought it worth mentioning either. When I explained what had happened, grandmother's face went through a series of expressions that I recognized, but had rarely seen directed at my parents. Disappointment, anger, something that looked almost like disgust. "They didn't tell you?" she asked, her voice very quiet. "I guess they were focused on Derek," I said, falling back into my familiar pattern of making excuses. "He was sick too, and they were worried about him." Grandmother looked at me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing straight through all the careful rationalizations I'd built up over the years. "Food poisoning," she said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. How did you know?" "Because your mother called me 3 times to tell me how worried she was about Derek's food poisoning, but somehow she never mentioned that you were unconscious in intensive care." We sat in her kitchen that afternoon, drinking tea, and talking about things we'd never talked about before. About favoritism and family dynamics, and what happens when love becomes conditional on being the right kind of person who needs the right kind of help at the right kind of time. She told me stories about my father as a child, how he'd always been drawn to drama and crisis, how he'd learned early that the loudest person usually got the most attention. "Your parents love you," she said carefully. "But they love you the way they know how to love, not necessarily the way you need to be loved." It was the closest she'd ever come to criticizing them directly, and it meant everything to me to hear someone finally acknowledge that the dynamic I'd been living with my whole life wasn't normal or healthy or fair. As autumn turned to winter, I started visiting grandmother more frequently again. My health had stabilized, my energy was returning, and spending time with her felt like the most important thing I could be doing. She was declining more noticeably now, forgetting names and dates, sometimes seeming confused about where she was, or what year it was. But she was still herself in all the ways that mattered, still the person who had always seen me clearly and loved me unconditionally. I started staying over some weekends, helping her organize her pills, making sure she was eating regularly, just being present in case she needed anything. My parents would call occasionally to check in, usually after I'd already handled whatever small crisis had come up. They'd thank me for being so good to grandmother, for taking such good care of her, for being such a responsible granddaughter. Responsible, that word again, like it was the highest compliment they could imagine giving me. Derek visited exactly twice during those final months. Once for grandmother's 87th birthday, where he stayed for an hour, ate cake, and left to meet friends at a bar. Once for Christmas dinner, where he spent most of the meal talking about his latest business idea, and left immediately after eating to drive to some party he'd been invited to. Both times, my parents spent the entire visit focused on him, asking him questions about his life, laughing at his stories, making sure he felt included and valued. Both times, grandmother watched quietly from her chair by the window, and both times, I could see the sadness in her eyes as she realized that her grandson couldn't be bothered to really spend time with her, even when time was clearly running short. In early February, grandmother had what the doctors called a minor stroke. She was confused for several days, struggling to find words and sometimes not recognizing where she was. I took leave from work to stay with her, to coordinate with her doctors, to make sure she wasn't alone and frightened. My parents visited every few days, bringing flowers and asking how she was doing, but they always seemed relieved when I assured them that I had everything under control. Derek didn't visit at all during those 2 weeks. He was busy with a new job, my mother explained. He couldn't afford to take time off work right now. I didn't point out that I was also busy with a job, also couldn't really afford to take unpaid leave. I just nodded and continued doing what needed to be done. Grandmother recovered enough to come home, but she was different after the stroke. More fragile, more dependent, more aware that her time was limited. She started talking about practical things, about her house and her belongings, and what would happen after she was gone. She asked me to help her organize her important papers, to make sure her will was up to date, to serve as her medical power of attorney. I don't trust anyone else to make the right decisions, she told me one afternoon as we sat in her lawyer's office, signing documents. You understand what matters to me. The lawyer, a kind older man who had known grandmother for decades, walked us through everything carefully. The house, her savings accounts, her investments, her personal belongings. He explained how the will was structured, what provisions had been made, how everything would be handled when the time came. As we drove home afterward, grandmother was quieter than usual. When I asked if she was okay, she reached over and patted my hand. I want you to know, she said, that I see how much you've sacrificed for this family, how much you've given without being asked, how much you've done without being thanked. I want you to know that it doesn't go unnoticed. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back. It's not a sacrifice, I said. I love you, I know you do, dear, and I love you too, more than you know. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in early March, grandmother died peacefully in her sleep. I was the one who found her, arriving for our usual morning visit to discover that she'd passed sometime during the night. She looked peaceful, like she'd simply decided it was time to go and had drifted away without fuss or drama, which was so perfectly her that it made me smile even through my grief. The funeral was exactly what she would have wanted. Simple, dignified, filled with flowers from her garden and stories from people whose lives she'd touched. My parents were appropriately sad, appropriately supportive, appropriately present for all the right moments. Derek gave a lovely eulogy about childhood summers and grandmother's chocolate chip cookies, painting himself as the devoted grandson who had treasured every moment with her. It was a beautiful performance, and I think most people believed it. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday, a small gathering in the lawyer's office, with just immediate family present. I expected it to be straightforward. Grandmother had always been organized, always planned ahead, always made sure everything was properly documented and legally sound. What I didn't expect was the bomb she'd been quietly preparing to drop on our family dynamics. The lawyer cleared his throat as we settled into the leather chairs around his conference table, my parents on one side, Derek and me on the other. He opened the folder containing grandmother's final will and testament, dated just 3 months earlier, and began to read in his careful professional voice. The first part was routine. Small bequests to longtime neighbors and friends, donations to charities she'd supported, specific items left to specific people. Her antique sewing machine to Mrs. Chen, her recipe collection to her favorite great-niece, her garden tools to the young couple down the street, who had always admired her flowers. Then he got to the major assets. To my grandson Derek, she had left $5,000 and her collection of first edition books. A generous gift but not life-changing money. Derek nodded appreciatively, clearly pleased but not surprised. To my son and daughter-in-law, she had left $10,000 each and several pieces of antique jewelry that had been in the family for generations. Again, meaningful but not unexpected gifts. And then came the part that changed everything. The house, her investment portfolio, her savings accounts, everything else of significant value, she had left to me. All of it, the Victorian house that was worth more than I made in 3 years, the carefully managed investments that had grown steadily over decades, the savings account that represented a lifetime of careful financial planning. But that wasn't the real shock. The real shock came when the lawyer continued reading, coming to a section that grandmother had specifically requested be read aloud in full. To my beloved granddaughter Sarah, she had written, I leave the bulk of my estate not because I love her more than others, but because she has already proven herself to be the person our family could rely on when it mattered most. While others waited to be asked, she saw what needed to be done, and did it. While others made excuses, she made sacrifices. While others focused on their own needs, she focused on mine. I had hoped that this disparity in inheritance might serve as a wake-up call to the rest of my family, a chance for them to reflect on what love actually looks like in action, rather than in words. But I suspect that hope may be naive. Therefore, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. This inheritance comes with no obligations to share it with those who did not earn it through their actions. Sarah owes nothing to anyone, simply by virtue of being related to them. She has already given enough. The room was completely silent when the lawyer finished reading. I could feel everyone staring at me, but I couldn't seem to make myself look up from my hands. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. $5 million. That's what grandmother's estate was worth. $5 million that she had left to me, along with a letter that laid bare every family dynamic I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Derek was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with something I'd never heard from him before. Something that sounded almost like panic. "This has to be a mistake," he said. She was confused at the end. The stroke, the medications. She didn't know what she was doing. The lawyer looked at him with the patience of someone who had dealt with contested wills many times before. Mrs. Helen was evaluated by 2 independent physicians before signing this will, he said calmly. Both confirmed that she was mentally competent and fully understood the implications of her decisions. My father leaned forward in his chair, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment or both. "This isn't right," he said. "Family money should stay in the family. She can't just cut everyone else out like this." But she hadn't cut anyone else out, I wanted to say. She'd left them money, left them meaningful gifts, left them exactly what their level of involvement in her life had earned them. She'd just stopped pretending that blood relation was the same thing as actual relationship. I finally looked up, meeting each of their eyes in turn. My parents looked stunned and angry, like they were trying to figure out how to challenge something that couldn't be challenged. Derek looked like he was calculating exactly how much he'd counted on inheriting, exactly how much this unexpected turn of events was going to cost him. None of them looked happy for me. "Sarah," my mother said, her voice taking on that careful tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation, "surely you understand that this puts you in a difficult position. I mean, what would grandmother really want? For the family to be torn apart by money." And there it was. The subtle manipulation, the gentle pressure, the assumption that I would do what I always did, and make everything easier for everyone else, even if it meant making things harder for myself. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't rush to smooth things over. I didn't immediately start thinking about how to make everyone else comfortable with a situation that was uncomfortable for me. Instead, I sat quietly in that leather chair, holding grandmother's final gift to me, and realized that she hadn't just left me her money. She'd left me her courage. The meeting ended with the lawyer explaining next steps, paperwork that needed to be filed, accounts that needed to be transferred. My parents and Derek left without saying much more, but I could see in their faces that this wasn't over. That they would be back, that there would be conversations and pressure and expectations that I would do the right thing and share what grandmother had specifically chosen not to share. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the neighborhoods where I'd grown up, past the houses where friends had lived, past the schools where I'd learned to be quiet and self-sufficient and careful not to ask for too much. Everything looked exactly the same, but somehow I felt completely different. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the legal documents that had just made me a millionaire, thinking about grandmother's letter and what she'd really been trying to tell me. That love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day through your actions. That family isn't just about who shares your DNA, it's about who shows up when showing up is hard. That I didn't owe anyone anything simply because they expected it from me. But I also knew that the real test wasn't going to be inheriting grandmother's money. It was going to be keeping it in the face of everything my family would do to convince me that I shouldn't. And for the first time in my life, I was ready for that fight. The phone calls started the next morning. My mother, bright and early at 7:30, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying to sound casual about something that was anything but casual. "Good morning, sweetheart. I hope you slept well. I was just thinking about yesterday. about everything with grandmother's will, and I wondered if you might want to talk things through with us. Maybe over dinner tonight? I was still in my pajamas, still processing the enormity of what had happened, still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that my quiet, gentle grandmother had essentially rewritten my entire future with a few signatures on legal documents. The last thing I felt ready for was a family strategy session disguised as a casual dinner invitation. I'm not really ready to talk about it yet, I told her honestly. I need some time to process everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear her recalibrating her approach. Of course, dear, I understand completely. It's a lot to take in, but you know, keeping things to yourself isn't always healthy. Sometimes it helps to talk through big decisions with people who love you. Big decisions. As if what to do with my inheritance was somehow a family decision rather than my own personal choice. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk, I said, and ended the conversation before she could push further. Derek called an hour later, his approach more direct but somehow even less appealing. Sarah, we need to discuss this situation, he said without preamble. I've been thinking about it all night, and I think grandmother was probably influenced by her illness more than anyone wants to admit. I mean, leaving everything to one person like that, cutting out her own son and grandson, that's not the grandmother we knew. Actually, I thought it was exactly the grandmother I knew. The one who paid attention to actions rather than words, who noticed when people showed up and when they didn't, who valued consistency over charm. But Derek had never really known that grandmother, because he'd never bothered to spend enough time with her to see past her polite, accommodating surface. The grandmother we knew was fair, he continued. She would never want to see the family torn apart like this. I think if you really consider what she would have wanted, you'll realize that the right thing to do is to divide everything equally among all of us. I found myself laughing, a short bitter sound that surprised even me. The right thing. According to Derek, the right thing was for me to give up the inheritance that grandmother had specifically chosen to leave to me, the inheritance that came with explicit instructions not to feel obligated to share it with people who hadn't earned it. I need to go, I told him. I'll talk to you later. But I won't, I thought as I hung up. Not about this, anyway. The calls continued throughout the day. My father, trying a different angle entirely, focusing on practical concerns about taxes and estate planning, and how complicated it would be for me to manage such a large inheritance on my own. Wouldn't it be easier, he suggested, to set up some kind of family trust where everyone could benefit from grandmother's hard work? My aunt, grandmother's daughter-in-law, called to express her concerns about family unity and the importance of honoring grandmother's memory by doing what she really would have wanted. My cousin called to share her opinion that inheritances should be shared equally among family members regardless of what the will actually said. Even Mrs. Chen, grandmother's neighbor, called to gently suggest that perhaps grandmother had been more confused in her final months than anyone had realized. By the end of the day, I felt like I was drowning in other people's opinions about what I should do with my own life. Every person who called seemed to have a different theory about grandmother's mental state, a different interpretation of what she really meant, a different suggestion for how I could fix this situation by giving away what she had chosen to give to me. What nobody seemed willing to consider was that grandmother had meant exactly what she said. I turned off my phone and spent the evening in my apartment, reading through the legal documents again and again, studying every word of grandmother's letter. She had been so clear, so deliberate, so specific about her reasoning. She wasn't confused or coerced or influenced by medications. She was making a statement about love and action and what it really means to care for someone, and she was protecting me from exactly what was happening now. The pressure intensified over the next few days. My parents started showing up at my apartment unannounced, always with some new concern or suggestion or piece of advice about handling the inheritance responsibly. Derek began sending me long text messages full of calculations about fair distribution and family harmony, and what grandmother really would have wanted if she'd been thinking clearly. Everyone had an opinion, everyone had a solution. Everyone knew better than grandmother herself what her final wishes should have been. The breaking point came on Friday evening, 5 days after the will reading. I was exhausted from a long week back at work, tired of screening phone calls and avoiding family members and pretending that everything was normal when clearly nothing would ever be normal again. I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, maybe ordering takeout and watching something mindless on television. Instead, I came home to find my entire family sitting in my living room. They'd gotten my spare key from my parents, apparently, and had let themselves in to stage what could only be described as an intervention. My mother and father were on my couch, Derek was in my armchair, and they'd even brought my aunt and uncle for additional support. They looked up when I walked in, wearing expressions of concern and determination that might have been touching if they hadn't been sitting uninvited in my personal space. "Sarah," my mother said, rising to hug me as if this was a perfectly normal family gathering. "We were worried about you. You've been avoiding us all week, and we just wanted to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I said, still standing in my own doorway, keys in my hand, trying to process the fact that my family had essentially broken into my apartment to ambush me. "I'm just tired." "That's exactly why we're here," my father said, gesturing for me to sit down like I was a guest in my own home. "We're worried that you're isolating yourself, that you're not thinking clearly about this inheritance situation. We want to help you work through it." Work through it, as if my grandmother's final wishes were some kind of problem that needed to be solved rather than a gift that needed to be respected. I sat down on the edge of my coffee table, facing them, trying to keep my voice calm and level. "There's nothing to work through. Grandmother left her estate to me. That's what she wanted, and I'm going to honor her wishes." "But sweetheart," my aunt interjected, "surely you can see how this looks. I mean, you were spending so much time with her at the end, helping with her medications, making decisions about her care. People might think you influenced her somehow. People might think I influenced her, by taking care of her when she needed care, by being present when she was lonely, by showing up when showing up mattered." The accusation was so absurd and so hurtful that I could barely form words to respond. "Are you suggesting that I manipulated grandmother?" I asked quietly. "Of course not," my mother said quickly, shooting my aunt a warning look. "Nobody's suggesting anything like that. We just think that maybe grandmother wasn't considering the bigger picture when she made these decisions. She was focused on you because you were there, but that doesn't mean she wanted to exclude the rest of us permanently." Derek leaned forward in his chair, adopting the reasonable, measured tone he'd always used when he wanted something. "Sarah, I've been doing some research on inheritance law, and there are actually legal precedents for challenging wills when the distribution seems unfair or when there's evidence that the person making the will was under undue influence." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Do what we want, or we'll drag this through the courts and make your life miserable." I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA, who had raised me, who claimed to love me, and realized that they were willing to destroy me to get what they wanted. They were willing to accuse me of elder abuse, willing to challenge grandmother's mental competency, willing to turn my inheritance into a legal battle that could last for years, all because they couldn't accept that their actions had consequences. "You want to challenge the will," I said, still keeping my voice calm. "You want to claim that grandmother was mentally incompetent, when she specifically chose to leave her estate to the person who had been taking care of her for years." "We don't want to challenge anything," my father said. "We just want to find a solution that works for everyone. A compromise that honors grandmother's memory while also maintaining family relationships. A compromise." They wanted me to compromise away the gift that grandmother had fought to give me, the gift that represented her acknowledgement of everything I had sacrificed, everything I had given, everything I had been to her when nobody else could be bothered. I stood up, walked to my front door, and opened it wide. "I think you should leave," I said. They stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. My mother started to protest. My father began to argue. Derek launched into another speech about family loyalty and doing the right thing. But I just stood there holding the door open, waiting. Eventually, reluctantly, they filed out. My mother paused at the threshold to hug me, whispering that she hoped I would reconsider, that she knew I would make the right choice in the end. My father squeezed my shoulder and told me to call if I wanted to talk things through more rationally. Derek handed me a business card for a family mediator who specialized in inheritance disputes. Even in leaving, they couldn't resist one more attempt to manage me. After they were gone, I locked the door, turned off all the lights, and sat on my living room floor in the dark. For the first time since grandmother's death, I let myself really cry, not just for her, though I missed her desperately, but for the family I had spent my whole life wishing I had. The family that would be happy for my good fortune, instead of resentful of it. The family that would celebrate grandmother's final gift to me instead of trying to take it away. That night, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable to me just a week earlier. I was going to keep every penny of grandmother's inheritance, exactly as she had intended. Not because I was selfish or greedy or influenced by money, but because she had seen something in me that was worth rewarding, something in my character that was worth investing in. And she had also seen something in my family's character that was worth protecting me from. The next morning, I called the lawyer and asked him to recommend a financial advisor who specialized in managing large inheritances. I wanted to make sure grandmother's money was invested wisely, protected properly, used in ways that would honor her memory and values. I also asked him about the legal strength of the will, about what would happen if my family decided to challenge it in court. The will is ironclad, he assured me. Mrs. Helen was very thorough, very deliberate about every provision. She anticipated that there might be challenges, and she took steps to ensure that her wishes would be respected regardless of family pressure. She had protected me even from this, even from the legal battles and accusations and attempts to undermine her final decisions. She had loved me enough to shield me from the worst impulses of people who claimed to love me, but seemed incapable of putting my well-being ahead of their own desires. Over the next few weeks, I began to understand what grandmother had really left me. It wasn't just money, though the financial security was life-changing. It wasn't just her house, though I loved every creaky board and faded wallpaper pattern. It was freedom. Freedom from the exhausting cycle of trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. Freedom from managing other people's emotions at the expense of my own. Freedom from carrying the weight of family dynamics that had never been my responsibility to fix. I took a leave of absence from work and spent my days at grandmother's house, going through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate, learning the rhythms of the place that was now mine. I found boxes of photographs, letters from friends and family members dating back decades, journals that revealed a woman who had been far more perceptive and thoughtful than most people had ever realized. In one of her journals, dated just a few months before her death, I found an entry that made me cry all over again. Sarah came by today to help me organize my medications. She didn't need to be asked, didn't wait for an invitation, just saw what needed to be done and did it. She's been doing that her whole life, I think. Seeing what needs to be done and doing it, even when nobody notices or thanks her for it. Especially then. I worry that she doesn't understand her own worth, that she's spent so many years being taken for granted that she thinks that's all she deserves.
I hope my final gift to her will help her see herself the way I see her, as someone who is valuable, not because of what she does for others, but because of who she is. Reading those words, I finally understood what grandmother had been trying to teach me with her inheritance. That I mattered not because I was useful, but because I was me. That I deserved love not because I earned it through service and sacrifice, but because love should be freely given to people who are worthy of it simply by virtue of being themselves. It was a lesson I had never learned from my parents, a gift I had never received from my family, an understanding that had come to me only through the wisdom of an old woman who had spent her final months making sure I would be okay after she was gone. The harassment from my family continued, but it changed in character. When emotional manipulation didn't work, they tried guilt. When guilt didn't work, they tried anger. When anger didn't work, they tried to cut me off entirely, as if withholding their approval would somehow make me desperate enough to give up the inheritance in exchange for their attention. They seemed genuinely surprised when I didn't chase after them, didn't beg for their forgiveness, didn't offer to negotiate a settlement that would bring me back into their good graces. Instead, I started building a different kind of life. I found a new financial advisor who helped me understand the full scope of what I had inherited and how to manage it responsibly. I hired contractors to repair and update grandmother's house, turning it into a place where I could live comfortably while honoring her memory. I researched charities and causes that had been important to her, setting aside money for donations that would continue her legacy of quiet generosity. And I started saying no to people who had grown accustomed to my automatic yes. When my mother called to ask if I would cover Derek's rent for a few months while he got back on his feet after losing his latest job, I said no. When my father asked if I would co-sign a loan for him to expand his struggling business, I said no. When Derek himself called to ask for help with legal fees for his divorce, I said no. Each no felt like a small revolution, a tiny reclamation of power that I had spent my whole life giving away to people who had never appreciated it. The real test came in late spring, about 6 months after grandmother's death. I was working in her garden planting the vegetables she had always grown, trying to coax the same abundance from the soil that had flourished under her care. It was peaceful work, meditative in a way that helped me process everything that had changed in my life. I was kneeling between the tomato plants when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. When I looked up, I saw my entire family walking toward me with expressions of grim determination. They were dressed for business, carrying folders and documents, looking like they meant serious trouble. My father spoke first, his voice formal and cold in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Sarah, we've tried to work with you on this inheritance situation, but you've made it clear that you're not interested in doing the right thing for the family. So we're here to give you one final chance to reconsider before we take legal action." Legal action, they were really going to do it. They were really going to drag grandmother's memory through the courts, really going to accuse me of manipulating a dying old woman, really going to turn our family drama into a public spectacle because they couldn't accept that their actions had consequences. Derek stepped forward, holding out a folder. "We've had a lawyer draw up an agreement for equal distribution of the estate. Sign this and we can avoid a messy court battle that nobody wants." I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves, looking at these people who had raised me and realizing that I felt nothing but pity for them. They were so convinced that they deserved what grandmother had chosen not to give them, so determined to take from me what she had specifically chosen to give me, that they were willing to destroy whatever remained of our relationships to get it. "What makes you think you'll win?" I asked quietly. My mother stepped forward, her face flushed with anger or embarrassment or both. "We have evidence," she said, "records of how much time you spent with her at the end, how involved you were in her medical decisions, how much influence you had over her daily life. We have testimony from neighbors and friends who can speak to her declining mental state. Evidence that I loved her," I said. "Evidence that I showed up when she needed me, that I took care of her when everyone else was too busy. Evidence that I was present in her life in ways that mattered to her." "That's not love," Derek snapped. "That's manipulation. That's taking advantage of an elderly woman's loneliness and confusion to position yourself as the favorite grandchild." The accusation hung in the air between us like poison. In that moment, I realized that they really believed what they were saying. They had convinced themselves that my relationship with grandmother had been calculated rather than genuine, that my care for her had been strategic rather than loving, that my presence in her final months had been about securing an inheritance rather than simply being there for someone I adored. They couldn't imagine loving someone without expecting something in return, so they couldn't believe that I had. I looked at each of them in turn, these people who had shaped my childhood, who had taught me to be quiet and accommodating and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they chose to offer me. People who had trained me to believe that my worth was measured by my usefulness, that my value lay in making their lives easier rather than building a life of my own. "Go ahead," I said finally. "Challenge the will, drag this through the courts. Spend years trying to prove that grandmother didn't know her own mind when she chose to leave her estate to someone who actually loved her." They stared at me like I was a stranger, which I suppose I was. The quiet, accommodating Sarah they had known would never have stood up to them like this, would never have chosen her own interests over their desires, would never have been willing to let them face the consequences of their own choices. But that Sarah was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, someone who had learned the difference between love and manipulation, someone who was finally ready to protect herself from people who claimed to care about her but seemed determined to hurt her. My father's face was hard as stone. "You'll regret this," he said, "when you're sitting alone in that house with all that money and no family left who cares about you. You'll regret choosing greed over love." I smiled then, really smiled, for the first time since they'd arrived. I won't be alone, I said. I'll be surrounded by the love of someone who valued me for who I am rather than what I could do for her. I'll be living in the house of someone who saw worth in me that you never bothered to notice. I'll be building a life funded by the generosity of someone who loved me enough to protect me from people like you. They left without another word, and I went back to my gardening, back to coaxing life from the soil that grandmother had tended, back to building something beautiful in the space she had given me to grow. 3 months later, I received a call from my lawyer. My family had officially withdrawn their challenge to the will. Their own attorney had apparently advised them that they had no legal grounds for their case, that grandmother's mental competency was well documented, that their accusations against me were baseless and potentially defamatory. The inheritance was mine, free and clear, with no further challenges possible. I hung up the phone and walked out to grandmother's garden, now flourishing under my care, producing the same abundance it had always produced under hers. I sat on the old wooden bench, where she used to rest between weeding sessions, looking out at the vegetables and flowers that connected me to her memory, thinking about the gift she had really given me. It wasn't just financial security, though that mattered. It wasn't just a beautiful house, though I loved it. It was the knowledge that I was worthy of love, worthy of generosity, worthy of someone's faith in my character and future. It was the understanding that I didn't have to earn affection through service, didn't have to prove my value through sacrifice, didn't have to accept crumbs when someone was willing to offer me a feast. She had seen something in me that my family had never bothered to look for, and she had staked her fortune on the belief that I would use her gift wisely and well. I intended to prove her right. 2 years later, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when I heard about Derek's accident. The call came from Mrs. Peterson, an old family friend, who had somehow managed to stay neutral throughout the inheritance drama. She sounded shaken as she delivered the news. Derek had been driving home from a job interview when his car hit black ice on the interstate. The accident was serious, multiple injuries, emergency surgery, weeks of recovery ahead. He was alive but barely, and the medical bills were already piling up. My parents are at the hospital, she said carefully. They've been there for 3 days straight. I thought you should know. I thanked her for calling and hung up, then stood in my warm kitchen staring out at grandmother's garden, trying to process what I was feeling. There was concern, certainly. Despite everything that had happened between us, Derek was still my brother, still someone I had grown up with and shared childhood memories with. I didn't want him to suffer or die. But there was also a strange sense of detachment, like hearing about the troubles of someone I had once known, but no longer felt connected to. The person who had accused me of manipulating our dying grandmother, who had threatened to drag me through court, who had tried to take away the gift she had left me, felt more like a stranger than family. I didn't call the hospital. I didn't rush to his bedside. I didn't offer to help with medical expenses, or coordinate care arrangements. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't automatically step up to manage a family crisis that wasn't mine to manage. Instead, I went to work, came home to my beautiful house, and continued living the life I had built with grandmother's blessing. The silence from my family during Derek's recovery was telling. No calls asking for help, no requests for financial support, no updates on his condition. They had learned, it seemed, not to expect anything from me anymore. They had accepted that the old Sarah, the one who would drop everything to fix their problems, was gone. 3 weeks after the accident, Derek himself called me. His voice was weak but determined, lacking the confidence that had always characterized his interactions with me. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "About everything, about what happened with grandmother's will, about the things I said, about the way our family has treated you." I waited, not making it easier for him by filling the silence. "I've had a lot of time to think while I've been stuck in this hospital bed," he continued. "About priorities and family, and what really matters. About the kind of person I've been, and the kind of person I want to be going forward." He paused, and I could hear him struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About grandmother, about the inheritance, about you. I was angry and jealous, and I said things that weren't true because I couldn't accept that she had seen something in you, that she hadn't seen in me." It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from Derek,
and while it wasn't enough to erase years of manipulation and entitlement, it was more honest than anything he had ever said to me before. "I'm not calling to ask for money," he said, apparently reading my silence correctly. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything after what happened. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why grandmother made the choices she did. You deserved that inheritance, you earned it in ways that I never did." We talked for a few more minutes, carefully and formally, like acquaintances rather than siblings. He told me about his injuries, his recovery process, his plans to move back in with our parents while he rebuilt his life. I told him about my work at the hospital, my renovations to grandmother's house, the garden I was learning to tend in her memory. It was a civil conversation, but it wasn't a reconciliation. Too much had been said and done for us to simply return to the relationship we had once had, but it was something, maybe a foundation for something different in the future. After we hung up, I realized that his call had answered a question I hadn't even known I was asking. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had sustained me through the legal threats and family pressure had burned itself out, leaving behind something calmer and cleaner. I wasn't interested in punishing them, or making them suffer for their choices. I just wasn't interested in being involved in their drama anymore. That summer, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to sell grandmother's house, and move somewhere new, somewhere that wasn't tied to my childhood, or my family history, or the complicated dynamics that had shaped so many years of my life. It wasn't an easy choice. I loved that house, loved the garden, loved the connection it gave me to grandmother's memory. But I realized that carrying her love with me didn't require staying in her physical space. The lessons she had taught me, the confidence she had given me, the future she had made possible for me, those things lived inside me now. I could honor her memory anywhere. I found a beautiful cottage about 3 hours north, near a small lake surrounded by mountains. It was far enough from my hometown to feel like a fresh start, but close enough that I could still visit friends when I wanted to. The cottage needed work, but it had good bones, and a large garden space where I could continue growing the vegetables and flowers that connected me to grandmother's teachings. I didn't tell my family about the move until after I had already signed the papers and hired the movers. When I finally called to give them my new address, the conversations were brief and awkward. They asked why I was moving, whether I was running away from something, if I was sure I was making the right decision. "I'm not running from anything," I told them. "I'm running towards something better." The cottage became my sanctuary, my project, my canvas for creating the life I had always wanted but never known how to ask for. I hired local contractors to update the kitchen and bathrooms, planted an ambitious garden that would have made grandmother proud, and slowly filled the space with furniture and art and books that reflected my own tastes rather than anyone else's expectations. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to please anyone but myself. I wasn't decorating for family visits that might never come, wasn't choosing colors that would appeal to people who rarely bothered to visit anyway. I was creating a space that made me happy, that felt like home in a way that nowhere else ever had. I also started volunteering at the local hospital, using my physical therapy background to help patients who couldn't afford private care. It was rewarding work that connected me to my community and gave me a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with family obligations or inherited guilt. Through my volunteer work, I met Maria, a nurse who had moved to the area for the same reasons I had. She was building a new life after her own complicated family situation, and we bonded over long conversations about boundaries and self-worth, and the courage it takes to choose yourself when everyone else expects you to choose them instead. We became close friends, then something more, then partners in the truest sense of the word. She understood why I had moved so far from my family, why I guarded my peace so carefully, why I was building a life that prioritized my own happiness for once. She had fought her own battles for independence and self-respect, and she celebrated my victories as if they were her own. 2 years after moving to the cottage, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in the garden on a Saturday morning when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. When I looked up, I saw my mother walking toward me, looking older and more fragile than I remembered. She had found my address somehow, probably through Mrs. Peterson or another family friend, and had driven the 3 hours to see me without calling first.
She stood at the edge of my garden looking uncertain, like she wasn't sure if she would be welcome. "Hello, Sarah," she said quietly. "You look well." I set down my gardening tools and brushed the dirt from my hands, trying to read her expression. She didn't look angry or demanding the way she had during the inheritance battles. She looked tired and sad and smaller somehow, like the fight had gone out of her. "Mom," I said, "what brings you here?" She gestured toward the cottage, the garden, the peaceful life I had built for myself. "I wanted to see how you were living," she said, "to see if you were happy." It was such an unexpected reason for her visit that I didn't know how to respond. We had spent so many years focused on what I could do for the family, what obligations I owed to other people, what sacrifices I should make for the greater good. The idea that she might actually care about my personal happiness was foreign to both of us. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, falling back on the basic politeness that grandmother had taught me. We sat on my back porch overlooking the lake, drinking tea and making careful conversation about safe topics. She told me about Derek's recovery, how he had finally found steady work and was slowly paying back the money our parents had lent him over the years. She told me about Dad's retirement, how they were downsizing their house and simplifying their lives. She asked about my work, my cottage, my garden, and for once she seemed genuinely interested in my answers rather than just waiting for her turn to talk about more important family matters. After an hour of careful politeness, she finally addressed the real reason for her visit. "I owe you an apology," she said, staring out at the lake instead of looking at me. "For a lot of things, but especially for the way we handled grandmother's will. We were wrong to pressure you, wrong to threaten legal action, wrong to make you feel guilty for receiving a gift that you had earned through your love and care." It was an apology I had stopped expecting years earlier, and hearing it now felt strange and anticlimactic. The hurt was still there, but it had been tempered by time and distance and the satisfaction of building a life that didn't depend on their approval. "I also owe you an apology," she continued, "for the way we raised you and Derek so differently. For making you feel like you had to earn love while giving him love unconditionally. For taking your reliability for granted while excusing his failures. For treating you like you didn't need the same care and attention that we gave him." She turned to look at me then, and I could see tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother saw what we couldn't see, or what we chose not to see. That you were the one holding our family together, the one making sacrifices for everyone else's benefit, the one who deserved to be taken care of for once instead of always being the one doing the taking care of." The words I had waited my whole life to hear, delivered 2 years too late and 3 hours away from the life I had built without them. They mattered, but not in the way they would have mattered if she had said them when I was still begging for her recognition. "Thank you," I said simply. "I appreciate you saying that." We finished our tea in companionable silence, both of us understanding that this conversation was an ending rather than a beginning. She wasn't asking me to come home, and I wasn't offering to rebuild a relationship that had caused both of us so much pain. When she got up to leave, she hugged me carefully, like I was something precious that she had learned too late to value. "I'm proud of you," she said, "for standing up for yourself, for building this beautiful life, for having the courage to choose yourself when we couldn't choose you." After she left, I sat on my porch for a long time, thinking about forgiveness, and family, and the strange ways that love sometimes shows up when you least expect it. I wasn't ready to welcome my family back into my daily life, might never be ready for that. But I was glad that she had come, glad that she had finally seen what grandmother had seen, even if it was too late to change the fundamental dynamics between us. That evening, Maria found me still sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the lake. She settled beside me without asking questions, understanding that sometimes the best support is simply presence. "How are you feeling?" she asked eventually. "Free," I said, and realized it was true. Not angry anymore, not hurt anymore, not hoping for something that was never going to come. Just free to live the life I had chosen, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Derek was getting married to a woman I had never met, someone he had met during his recovery, who had helped him become a better version of himself. The invitation was simple and sincere, addressed to me and Maria both, with a handwritten note on the back.
I know things have been complicated between us, but you're my sister and I'd love for you to be there if you feel comfortable coming. No expectations, no pressure, just an invitation extended with love. Maria and I talked about it for weeks, weighing the potential awkwardness against the possibility that this might be a chance for a different kind of relationship with my family. In the end, we decided to go, not because I owed them anything, but because I was curious to see who Derek had become, and whether enough had changed for us to find some kind of peace. The wedding was small and beautiful, held in a garden not unlike grandmother's. Derek looked happy and healthy, older and more mature than I had ever seen him. When he saw me arrive, he smiled with genuine pleasure, and came over to hug me. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It means everything to me." His bride Jennifer was warm and kind, clearly someone who brought out the best in him. She thanked me for being there, told me how much Derek had wanted his sister present for this important day, how he had spoken often about wanting to repair our relationship. My parents were there too, polite and careful, maintaining the same respectful distance that had characterized our interactions since my mother's visit. They seemed genuinely happy to see me, but they didn't push for more than I was willing to give. During the reception, Derek found me sitting at a table overlooking the garden, watching other people dance and celebrate. "I'm glad you came," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm glad I came too," I said, and meant it. "This is beautiful. She seems wonderful." "She is. She's helped me become someone I actually like, someone who thinks about other people's feelings before my own. Someone who shows up when it matters." He paused, looking out at the garden where his new wife was laughing with friends. "I think about grandmother a lot," he said quietly. "About how she must have felt, watching us all these years, watching me take everything for granted while you gave everything you had. I understand now why she made the choices she did." I nodded, not needing to say anything. "I'm working on making amends," he continued. "Not just to you, but to everyone I've hurt over the years. It's a long process, but Jennifer keeps me accountable. She doesn't let me slide by on charm or excuses the way everyone else always did." We talked for a few more minutes, carefully but warmly, two people who shared a history but were building very different futures. When he got up to rejoin his wedding party, he squeezed my shoulder. "I hope we can be in each other's lives going forward," he said. "Not the way we were before, but something healthier, something real, maybe," I said. "We'll see," and that felt like enough, for now, not a full reconciliation, but not a permanent estrangement either. Just two adults who had learned to see each other clearly, with all their flaws and strengths, and were willing to consider the possibility of building something new from the ashes of what had been broken. Maria and I drove home that evening through the mountains, talking about family and forgiveness, and the complicated ways that people sometimes find their way back to each other. I felt lighter somehow, like I had finally closed a chapter of my life that had been hanging open for too long. 3 years have passed since then, and my life has settled into rhythms that feel sustainable and satisfying. I still work at the local hospital, still tend my garden, still live in the cottage by the lake with Maria and the life we've built together. I speak to my family occasionally, brief phone calls and holiday cards, the kind of distant but cordial relationship that works for all of us. Derek and Jennifer visit once or twice a year, always calling first, always respecting boundaries, always bringing thoughtful gifts and interesting stories about their life together. He's become someone I genuinely enjoy spending time with in small doses, someone who has learned to listen more than he talks, someone who expresses gratitude for things he used to take for granted. My parents have never visited again, but they send letters sometimes, updates about their lives, and careful expressions of love that don't come with expectations or demands. It's not the relationship I once hoped for, but it's not painful anymore either. It's simply what it is. Last month, I received a call that I had been expecting but still wasn't prepared for. Chen, grandmother's old neighbor, called to tell me that she was moving into assisted living, and wondered if I might want any of the plants from grandmother's garden that she had been tending all these years. I drove down the next weekend, and spent the day carefully digging up seedlings and cuttings from the roses and perennials that grandmother had loved most. Mrs. Chen walked through the garden with me, sharing memories and stories, helping me identify which plants would transplant well, and which ones were better left to bloom where they were. As I loaded the car with pieces of grandmother's garden, I thought about how fitting it was. She had given me the tools to build a new life, and now I was literally transplanting pieces of her world into mine. The flowers would bloom in different soil, under different conditions, but they would carry her love forward into whatever future I chose to create. I planted grandmother's roses along the edge of my cottage garden, where I can see them from my kitchen window every morning. They're thriving in their new home, producing the same abundant blooms they had in her yard, the same sweet fragrance that had perfumed my childhood summers. Sometimes, when I'm working among them, I can almost feel her presence, her approval of the life I've built with the foundation she provided. Not just the money, though that gave me security and options I never could have imagined. Not just the house, though that gave me a place to heal and grow, but the knowledge that I was worthy of love, worthy of generosity, worthy of someone's faith in my character and future. She saw something in me that my family had missed, something that I had almost missed in myself. She saw that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud demands, that consistency could be more valuable than charisma, that love expressed through action could mean more than love expressed through words alone. And in her final gift to me, she didn't just give me financial security, she gave me permission to value myself the way she had valued me, to expect from others the same care and consideration I had always given, to build a life that prioritized my own happiness and well-being for once. It took me 30 years to learn that lesson, but I finally understand it now. Love isn't something you earn through service or sacrifice, or making yourself small enough to fit into other people's expectations. Love is something you deserve, simply by being yourself, something that should be given freely to people who are worthy of it, something that should make your life richer and easier, rather than harder and more complicated. I think grandmother would be proud of the woman I've become, the life I've built, the boundaries I've learned to maintain. I think she would love my cottage and my garden, and the peace I've found beside this quiet lake. I think she would approve of Maria and the partnership we've created, built on mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. Most of all, I think she would be glad to know that her final gift accomplished exactly what she intended. It didn't just give me money or property or security, it gave me the courage to choose myself, to demand better treatment from people who claim to love me, to build a life that reflects my own values rather than everyone else's expectations. And every morning when I look out at those roses blooming in soil they've never known before, I'm reminded that love can take root anywhere, can flourish in new conditions, can bloom more beautifully than ever when it's finally planted in the right place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.